It's now my pleasure and honor to introduce our presenter this evening, Dr. Fleet Maull. Fleet Maull, PhD, CMTP, is an author, mindfulness teacher, management consultant, trainer, and executive coach who facilitates deep transformation for individuals and organizations through his philosophy and program of radical responsibility. Dr. Maull currently serves as the CEO and Director of Training and Research and Development for Prison Mindfulness Institute, Center for Mindfulness and Public Safety, and the Engaged Mindfulness Institute. As well, he is the founder and CEO of Heart Mind Institute and Windhorse Seminars and Consulting. Dr. Maull is a pioneer and thought leader in the mainstream mindfulness movement, developing cutting-edge mindfulness-based and trauma-informed leadership trainings, transformational seminars, and consulting and coaching programs that he delivers in diverse business, nonprofit, and government settings, including his pioneering work in developing mindfulness-based emotional intelligence and mindfulness-based wellness and resiliency training programs. Dr. Maull is a certified professional mindfulness teacher and advisory board member with the International Mindfulness Teachers Association and a board member with the Institute for Organizational Mindfulness. Thank you very much, Fleet, for taking time to join us this evening.
Thank you, John. Excuse me. And thank you very much, Robert and Kimball and everyone involved in organizing this. And thank you, everyone, for showing up tonight and being here with us. So I think I'd like to start off by just giving you very briefly a little background myself in terms of the area of trauma and understanding trauma and mitigating the impacts of trauma, treating, healing trauma, and so forth, just kind of from whence I speak. So I grew up in an alcoholic family, so I had my share of those kind of childhood experiences. Actually, in many ways, a really good family, but a family that became completely crazy once or twice a week. So Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde kind of situation that creates a lot of splitting when children go through that experience. So I kind of grew up with that experience. Had my own bouts with alcohol and drug abuse in my teenage years and 20s, early 30s. I spent 14 years in a federal prison on drug charges. So I was in a maximum security federal prison hospital, which is could be considered a very traumatizing experience. It is for most. While there, I helped start the first hospice program in a prison anywhere in the world, as far as we know. And then from there, catalyzed a movement that now includes 70 or 80 prison hospice programs in this country and some abroad as well. So while I was there, I was doing a lot of things in terms of being in that environment, working in that environment. I was a school teacher for 14 years, was my day job, but I was also caring for men who were dying in that environment. Since getting out of prison, I've continued prison work. So through Prison Mindfulness Institute, Mindfulness and Center for Public Safety, we work with at-risk, incarcerated, returning youth and adults, and we have been for the last 14 years working with the professionals in the system as well, correctional officers, probation and parole officers, and now expanded into other first responders, police, sheriff's departments, even the courts, judges, prosecutors, public defenders, and so forth, as well as some healthcare professionals. And I also I've been going to Auschwitz every year for the last 22 years or so with the Zen Peacemakers as a leader of the Auschwitz Bearing Witness Retreat, bearing witness to what occurred there during the Holocaust, and have led bearing witness retreats in other places around the world, including in Rwanda, where I led 2 bearing witness retreats and spent 2 years, not an entire 2 years, but 2 periods there over a period of 2 years, training genocide survivors as paratrauma counselors to work at the village level throughout Rwanda, where especially during the memorial period every year, which is already started, begins April 7th and runs basically through July 4th when the genocide was taking place. And the whole country basically shuts down. It is basically shut down doing the memorial right now. And at least the last time I was there was 2011, I believe. The trauma reactions were getting successively worse for many people. And at the big memorial events, you literally see people being carried out who are going through severe trauma reactions. So I also engage with a lot of well-known trauma clinicians and the summits I lead, and interviewing them and working with the Collective Trauma Summit with Thomas Hubel and my own summits, and working with people like Peter Levine and Bessel Van der Kolk, Pat Ogden, Lori Leach, and many others, Stephen Porges. So that's kind of the background from which I speak. And I just share that because I may be saying some things tonight that may be a little different from what you might expect. We'll see. So I'm going to share. Can you give me, do I have share screen privileges? Looks like I do. Okay. So we're talking tonight about facilitating personal agency in trauma prevention and care. So that personal agency is quite important because kind of what I've learned through my own personal experience with my own adverse childhood experiences, and with whatever I've been through as an adult, and really in working with others, what I find really is ultimately most supportive to people is anything that is offered in an empowering way, and where we're really holding space for people. We're not pathologizing people. We're not seeing people as broken. We're not seeing people as fragile, but we're holding a very safe space for them, where we create the space in which they can find their own feet and do their own work and of healing. And so that emphasis on personal agency and empowerment is important for me, at any rate, how I've understood the work. So I'd like to make a distinction to begin with between stress and traumatic stress. So stress is a very necessary part of our lives, and normal and healthy part of our lives. And we are designed for acute stress responses, as I'm sure everybody knows here. And our autonomic nervous system, we can get the highly activated sympathetic branch and go beyond alertness into stress, into fight or flight, and all the way into either going into a very upregulated rigidity and freeze response, or going into a complete shutdown, kind of almost catatonic response in the extremes. And we're all very familiar with the lasting effects of extreme trauma experiences and extreme traumatic stress, resulting in the symptomology that's then described as PTSD. But stress itself is a very necessary part of our lives to challenge. We need to challenge ourselves to grow and evolve, just like what do we call putting stress on the muscles and bones, right? We call that exercise, right? And without exercise, our muscles and bones atrophy and become weak. Same thing, if we don't challenge ourselves with physical, emotional, mental, spiritual stress, challenge, discomfort, we're not going to grow and evolve. So stress is actually a very healthy thing. It's chronic stress that's the problem in the long run. But then there are those stressors that in the moment can completely overwhelm our ability to cope with them, or to metabolize that stressful experience physiologically, emotionally, and so forth. And so when we talk about traumatic stress, we're talking about stress that arises to that level. Now, whether we're talking about traumatic stress that's kind of an ongoing stress, which we work with a lot with first responders, or whether it's a specific incident kind of situation, it's very true that trauma is very much in the eye of the beholder, very much in the eye of the beholder. Two people can be in exactly the same experience, in the same place at the same time even. And one will walk away very debilitated with lasting trauma symptomology, and the other will be able to metabolize it and do just fine. In fact, one of my neighbors, when I met them, we had a conversation, and he was an Iraq veteran. And I started talking about some of the work I do with first responders. And, he talked about the fact that he and a buddy of his had the exact same experience in Iraq. They're in the same firefights, had exactly the same experiences during their time in the Iraq War. Very, incredibly challenging experiences, obviously. And he's just fine, and his buddy's life is a mess, right? So it's really in the eye of the beholder. So it's a little bit incorrect to say that experiences are traumatic experiences. Traumatic experiences are traumatic when they're perceived and experienced as traumatic. There's a book, first of all, I want to say that the increasing awareness that we've developed around trauma over the last 10, 15 years, even the last 5 years, even the last couple of years, is incredibly important, something I'm incredibly grateful for, and something very important to our work with first responders and corrections professionals. And at the same time, like anything in our society, we're a bit faddish, right? And so we end up taking things a little bit we go from denial to like everything's trauma, right? In fact, there was an article in the New York Times just a couple of months ago, I think, that was really talking about if everything is trauma, then what does trauma mean, right? And is trauma becomes synonymous with human suffering, which is, and obviously certain levels of physical, mental, emotional discomfort, losses, and so forth are part of our human life. So we tend to take it a little bit too far. And there's a recent book that I would recommend called The End of Trauma by George Bonanno, who's a researcher, I believe is at, he's at a university in New York. That's what I'll say. I don't remember the exact university at the moment, but he has a new book out, and he had a previous book called The End of Sadness or something like that. But it's meant to be a provocative title, but his book is a bit corrective and really taking an evidence-based view of trauma. I mean, he's clearly a research scientist, and he's really taking an evidence-based view at trauma and resilience. I think the subtitle of his book is The New Science of Resilience, right? So anyway, I just recommend that. So, just to realize that there is a distinction between trauma awareness and working in a trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive way, and the tendency to start pathologizing and then seeing people as fragile and relating with people in ways that are actually disempowering rather than empowering. And then the last thing I want to bring up is that, just to put it out there, the concept or the idea of actually anti-fragility training, which is, of course, not as nearly as well known as all the words associated around trauma, but it is out there, and I think it's a very important concept. Are we, in a way, we're relating with trauma at every level, in personal trauma, in terms of our relation around the very important awareness around historical trauma and ancestral trauma, trauma that's related around, one's life experience in extreme poverty or various forms of oppression or racism or prejudices around sexuality or gender expression. Very important that we have all the awareness around those things. But are we actually helping people cope better with their lives and integrate things and move forward in their life and co-create a world that is safer and for everyone? Or are we helping people become more fragile? And so I think it's at least worth it to have that concern, that awareness of that, and not just assume that everything's trauma and all trauma work is, that there could at least have the consideration things could begin to veer into areas where we're actually helping people become more fragile, and we're actually not helping people at all. And the idea of weatherproofing, because life is getting really difficult. And with climate change and the disruptions coming our way, life is not going to get any easier. And the idea that we can create some kind of bubbles of extreme safety and security of people where they won't have to experience challenges is not very realistic. It's never been the case historically, and it probably never will be the case. But with climate change, things are going to become very, very, very difficult in all likelihood. And so would it be helpful to really help people weatherproof themselves, and for all of us to become stronger, to both be, there to really support each other and support people when they need support, and even if we're falling apart or people are in a very fragile condition or very sensitized or suffering with genuine PTSD, but at the same time generally approaching it in a way that actually helps people become stronger and more resilient, and this idea of anti-fragility training and weatherproofing. So that's just putting some markers out there for a bit of the discussion. Having said that, I want to present here the 6 recognized guiding principles of trauma-informed care from SAMHSA. And I think these are very important. In terms of mindfulness, if you're interested in trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive approaches to mindfulness or teaching mindfulness, certainly my colleague David Treleaven's book, Trauma-Sensitive Mindfulness, is very good. And he structures his whole book around these 6 guiding principles of trauma-informed care. Now, we train mindfulness teachers through our nonprofit, and we are also bringing mindfulness into the criminal justice system, public safety system, and we talk about doing that in a trauma-informed way. In fact, I think our teacher training organization is probably one of the leading providers of trauma-informed mindfulness teacher training. But nonetheless, we do have this personal agency aspect that we build into our training, and some of the work, I think, goes a little bit far in the other direction. So having said that, this is still a wonderful framework to focus on. Safety is really job one when we're talking about trauma, really for ourselves and for others, any kind of work that we're going to do. whether it's reconstructive therapy, where we're kind of putting ourselves back together or helping others kind of put themselves back together, or whether it's more personal evolution and growth work where people are trying to, go to the next level of their evolution and competence. It all has to be done in an environment of safety, in an environment of a challenging environment. There was I've been involved in circle work, for 40 years, various types of circling work and dialogue work and counsel work. And there was a woman that wrote a book about circle work, Starhawk, a self-described kind of priestess, shaman, and activist. And she said circles, and doing this kind of circle work, circles are safe places to do unsafe things, right? So holding the safe space where we can challenge ourselves, other people can, titrating it, empowered to titrate their own experience, can challenge themselves to grow and evolve, to heal, grow, and evolve. So safety, understanding safety in that way. Trustworthiness and transparency. Just whatever work we're doing, whether it's in group settings or one-on-one settings, just being really transparent about who we are, where we're coming from, what our context is, what our view is, and what we're delivering and how we're delivering it, what our role is, being really clear about any power differentials that there are, and making all of that transparent is really part of creating trustworthiness and safety. So people, they see what they see is what they get, and that things are done in such a way that everyone can feel, okay, I can be in this space and I can trust the space. And what's being said here is trustworthy and transparent. There are no secrets. I'm not going to get blindsided by anything. Peer support is really important, which is why in our mindfulness-based wellness and resiliency training programs, our flagship 10-week program, really the heart of it is the community of practice groups. We may start off with a cohort of 50, 60, 100, 300 people. They're divided into groups, small groups of 10 to 12 people that meet with co-facilitators once a week over 8 weeks. And the peer support aspect of those trainings is critically important. And we all know how important peer support is in first responder agencies. And hopefully, that's good. The knowledge and the delivery of peer support is getting a lot more sophisticated in the first responder community. Collaboration and mutuality. Again, this kind of goes along with trustworthiness and transparency. How do we create that helping alliance, that therapeutic alliance at whatever level of appropriateness, whether we're just with a group of peers, how do we collectively create a safe group where we have that mutuality and that collaboration, and whether we're learning together or studying together or doing group therapy together or doing professional learning together, but we have that sense of mutuality and collaboration, right? And if we're a facilitator or a leader in such group, we know our job is actually to facilitate that group experience for that group to co-create together the trustworthiness and transparency, to co-create together the collaboration and mutuality. And of course, I've been speaking about empowerment. And so, rather than seeing people as fragile, broken, and pathologizing, can we really, there's I think it's said to go all the way back to Lao Tzu, which is, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. The idea, if we feed a person, we feed them fish, we feed them for one day, and if we teach them to fish, we feed them for their whole lifetime, right? So that idea of how can we empower people, and can we give people voice? Now, in terms of, just to give an example of that, in trauma-informed mindfulness teaching, one of the most important things is using non-command language, because a lot of us originally were trained to teach, even guide meditations. Okay, now sit up straight. Then follow your breath. That's kind of directive command language. And today we've all been learning to more so sitting with a relatively uplifted posture and finding that posture that for you feels uplifted. And then as you're ready, you're invited to begin bringing your attention to the body, to your experience of the body. So that invitational language rather than command language, a lot of use of the present participle, and giving lots of choices. Working with juveniles, I've done a lot of work with juveniles and various levels of the juvenile system. And it's critically important to give them lots of options and lots of choices, because they've been experiencing very few options and choices largely their whole life, right? And also, when people have suffered from severe trauma and are experiencing really severe trauma reactions, internalized trauma, the reason it got internalized so deeply, especially in terms of childhood experiences, is they had no choice. They were stuck in it. They couldn't fight back. They couldn't run away, and they couldn't escape. Right. That's one of the reasons why often childhood traumas really embed deeply. Right. So choice is really important. So giving people voice, giving people choice, but also empowering people and holding that space for people and trusting that people can do their own work with, if provided with sufficient safety, support, and guidance. And then finally, cultural, historical, and gender issues. So we're becoming a lot more aware about all of this and understanding that the context is really important. Whoever we're working with, there may be multi levels of various kinds of traumatic experiences historically, even in the genetic expression, what we're understanding, how things can be passed on genetically. But even within one's lifetime of the context one has grown up in, can really impact their experience in many ways, and also having that cultural humility that we can't really stand in another person's shoes. So we need to be really careful about any assumptions we're making about their experience. At the same time, we need to be able to act. We need to be able to serve. So sometimes we can go so far in the awareness of these things that we become like we're tiptoeing around people, and we're almost frozen and unable to serve and act and really support, because we become so sensitized to these issues. So there's a balance, very important part of this, and again, coming to that balance. So the last thing I wanted to go through here, and then we'll just open it up to some dialogue, is this idea of the window of tolerance or zone of resilience. I personally find it's a very helpful map from Dan Siegel's work. And you see in there that central zone there called the resilience zone, or the window of tolerance. And that's really where we're able to respond to life from our best self, with our best resources. We're able to be in a relational, responsive mode regarding the challenges of our life in the moment, as opposed to getting triggered back into some kind of fear and survival-based reactive mode, right? And we all know that lots of things can trigger us emotionally, and we get triggered into that fight or flight or emotional reactivity and so forth. And a lot of what's getting triggered is old tapes and childhood experiences and so forth. And we get triggered into things, and we get triggered, we go in one of two directions. We either get really overactive, we get hyperactive, and that can go in the direction of acting out. It can go from frustration to anger, to rage, to aggression, to even violence. Or on the other hand, it can go into rigidity and get into obsessive compulsive behaviors and compensating behaviors, addictions, overeating, and things like that, impulsivity. Or it can go into the freeze response, which is really a very overacted, very upregulated response, but it goes into total paralysis, the absolute freeze response. So it can go in that direction of hyperarousal, or it can go, we can start shutting down into hypoarousal, and we start going into disassociation and shutting down in some way. So for example, when we're leading groups and when people are teaching mindfulness, which we do a lot of, and you're doing group work, we're constantly on, alert. And for example, even if we're leading practices where people have their eyes closed, we always keep our eyes open, because we're observing what's going on in the group and with individuals, and noticing whether people are starting to slip into some kind of disassociation, or they're showing physical signs of trauma reactivity or PTSD, or any way in which the space is not workable for them or becoming unworkable for them, right? So there's all kinds of things over there you see on the left that can trigger us out of that space of workability. And then there's all the strategies on the right that'll get us back into that space, right? So anything that's grounding, right? Physically grounding, like even just, touching ourselves, rubbing our legs, squeezing our muscles, the tapping that a lot of people use, just remembering your feet, feeling your feet on the ground immediately brings you into your body. You feel yourself grounded. Sitting in a chair and just really just taking a moment to just sit and physically feel your body. All forms of mindfulness, bringing your attention to the body in a moment, but in a way that works for you, because bringing your attention to the body in the moment might be over traumatizing or over triggering, let's say, or stimulating. So instead, you might shift your attention outwards and focus on identifying colors in the room or objects in the room. But nonetheless, it's some form of attention switching to awareness and to mindfulness. And then breath work can be extremely helpful. And we're going to do a breath exercise before we finish here. So breath work can be extremely helpful. Now, what I think is really helpful about this map is to understand is that over time, for all of us in life, that resilience zone shrinks. When we're 6 months, 18 months old, little kids, that resilience zone is just wide open. We're fearless, completely uninhibited. We'll get into anything, which is why our parents need to really keep close eye on us to keep us out of trouble, keep us from hurting ourselves, right? So, but it's just wide open. And then with the bumps and bruises of life, we start to shrink. And, oh, that was really embarrassing. I won't do that again. Oh, that scared me. I won't do that again. Oh, I feel like I kind of got shamed for that. I'm not going to do that again, right? And so our life starts shrinking. That happens to all of us, right? And by the time we're adults, our lives have shrunk quite a bit, which is why some people are into super high performance. They'll say you should do something that terrifies you every day. Now, that may be a bit extreme, but maybe we could do something that we're a little uncomfortable with each day, right? Because that's how we begin to reclaim our life and a larger bandwidth of life's challenges that we can handle from our best self in a relational, resilient, responsive way, right? So the way that we do that is we lean into the edges, right? We lean into those areas of discomfort. And this is really the basis of almost all trauma treatments. Peter Levine's idea of pendulating, right? So we find some safe ground. We find some place of workability. Actually, in some ways, I like workability better than safety. Safety is kind of a loaded word, but we find some place where we feel okay. Now, sometimes a trauma therapist will help you get there by holding their hands back on your kidneys or down on your feet, some of that human contact, or they'll help you find a way that you can hold your posture or your voice, or a way you can find, I'm okay. When I organize myself this way, when I focus this way, I'm good. It's my home base, right? And I really learned how to get there and how to get back there. So that's part of the work, first establishing that home base. And then we lean into that which is uncomfortable. So those could be memories. Those could be places in the body where trauma is held or located. So we lean into that which is a bit uncomfortable and, just to learn to tolerate a little bit. And then we come back to home base where it's completely workable. We regather ourselves. Then when we're ready, we lean in again to that which is uncomfortable. Maybe we lean a little farther if we can, but with it, we don't go too far. It's not about being reckless, not about pushing ourselves over the edge, and we come back. So we lean in, we come back. We lean in. Peter Levine calls this pendulating. And ideally, a trauma therapist is training a client to do that on their own, to learn to self-titrate themselves doing that. Because that's what makes it really, they're not dependent on the therapist guiding them continually, but they learn to guide themselves. They learn to titrate their own experience. And so they can do it not just in a session, but they can do it in the midst of their life. So that's the empowering aspect of the work. But that idea of pendulating is very important. It's really how we reclaim our lives and how we can expand. The extreme, some people would, because of various forms of PTSD and various causes of that kind of really, really extreme constellation of symptomology, they end up with agoraphobia. They literally can't leave their home. It's too triggering to be, outside the home, much less go to some place where there's a lot of people, like a shopping mall or a meeting of some kind. So that's how much it shrinks, right? And so the treatment is always, how do you begin to expand it? It's that pendulating quality, and almost always done in the body. So then so that, I think, just kind of gives us a map of the work. And there's one last thing I'd like to introduce. And this is how mindfulness practice, I think, properly instructed and properly done, can really do everything we're talking about. Now, I don't know if people are familiar with internal family systems, Richard Schwartz's work. It's an extremely popular model of psychotherapy around the world. And like most modern psychologies from Freud forward, it relates with these various parts and sub-personalities and voices in us. Another model is voice dialogue. Hal and Idris Shaw's work, I think. Voice dialogue, internal family systems, and so forth. That we have all of these, but we think we're one unified I, but we're actually multiplicity of I's and parts and so forth. And we have these exiled parts that from aversive or adverse childhood experiences, these parts that we stuff or deny, and Jung called it the shadow that forms. So, and then some of these get burdened with various forms of shame and guilt and so forth. So the way that all this becomes healed is really, we need to do the work of all these parts and really develop the self-awareness to see that there's all these different parts, all these different voices, and begin to relate with them. And the more we relate with them, we start to get in touch with, well, who's relating with them? Who's relating with them? And obviously there's some larger self, some awareness that's relating to all this. And that's what Richard Schwartz in Internal Family Systems called self with a capital S. And he discovered this through his working with patients over many decades, that once they started really relating with these different parts, then they also started connecting with this part of themselves that could relate with all of that. And that part had these natural qualities called the 8 C's, which are things like compassion and curiosity and courage and so forth. And so properly instructed, properly practiced mindfulness is training ourselves to be with our experience in a moment as it is. It's not about cultivating any particular kind of experience. It can be used to suppress experiences. It can be used to try to escape into some kind of transcendental experience, but that's not mindfulness properly taught. That's not classic mindfulness. Classic mindfulness is just training our mind to be able to be with our experience, whatever it is, moment to moment, and allow it to be as it is. And to the extent that we're able to do that, all these different parts, they start to surface. They surface as thoughts, they surface as emotions, they surface as memories, and they gradually work their way through our system. And there's a natural healing that can take place because we're allowing, we're befriending, and so forth. And so that natural healing work is about befriending ourselves and recognizing, being self-aware, acknowledging, and so forth. And the power of mindfulness to do this. I had a conversation just recently with Richard Schwartz, actually, and we were talking about how mindfulness could really do that properly done. And he said, yeah, I said, I'm not trying to put your therapist out of business. He goes, no, I'd love to put them all out of business. And he completely agreed that mindfulness properly done really kind of does the work of internal family systems in kind of a natural, organic way. So anyway, I think that's enough of a download there.
Well, yeah, I would love to give everybody an opportunity to comment or contribute or possibly have questions for you, Fleet. And you're all welcome to unmute. You can speak. If you want to type into the chat, you're welcome to do that as well. So we encourage somebody to break the ice, and some of that was very provocative. Fleet, very thorough. Thank you very much.
I can break the ice. I don't mind.
Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel.
Certainly. I really appreciate the wording of anti-fragility training and weatherproofing. What came up for me as I heard you talk about that and heard you talk about, like the base, the foundation of that is mindfulness training. What came up for me is what comes next is emotional awareness and emotional tolerance, because what I think we've done in society is not really done a good enough job teaching that core emotions come and they go, and you can tolerate that. And that feels like the next level of the house, to make people a bit less fragile, a bit less intolerant to suffering that we can guarantee is going to come, right? So like I really loved that, like anti-fragility. Yes, please. And then what we do at our practice, and Roxy's at my practice, I don't know if you guys kind of met her or not, but we really work a lot on those core emotions and building a mindful, present awareness, but then educating that, yeah, you're going to feel things, and feelings come and they peak in intensity and they go, and then they peak and they don't peak as high. We seem to just not have that in our society. And so we want to run away from every emotion that feels uncomfortable or it feels threatening. So we're suddenly in our fight, flight, or freeze response. Yeah. So I loved that. And then,
Rachel, would you mind if I just made a comment about what you just said?
Yeah.
I was thinking about that too, not as eloquently as you, but the word that came to mind for me was grit. It's okay to have some grit. It's not a very technical term, but that's kind of, I think, a little bit about what you're talking about.
Well, and to me, Kimball, we've done this all or nothing with our emotions. Either I absolutely can't tolerate them, so I shut down, or I rage because I'm uncomfortable, or I just numb them. I'm constantly in a defense trying to figure out how to move away from them. And grit is the middle road, right? Grit is, I can handle hard things,
Yeah, grit's in it. It's in concept. It's I don't tend to use it for reasons. It's incredibly unpopular in today's academic culture because grit is usually thought of as something people are born with, and they either have it or they don't, right? And also in academia today, around the whole subject of trauma, people only want to talk about the social causes and conditions, and the things we need to do so people don't have to suffer, right? They don't want to talk about individual responsibility for being resilient or anything like that, and they hate the word grit. So anyway, I tend to avoid the word grit just because it tends to be taught. It tends to be related to something you're born with. But I think we can train ourselves to be highly resilient and be weatherproofed. And so I'm just not, I only bring that up. I'm not sure grit's the best word for it, but I know what you're talking about. And we can certainly train ourselves to be less fragile, to be more resilient, and so forth. And I'm right with you there, Rachel. You know, it's about that. You're talking about widening that zone of resilience so we can handle the emotions, right? And we generally call our work mindfulness-based emotional intelligence work. And it's so wonderful today that in K through 12 education, children are being introduced to the integration of what they call social emotional learning and mindfulness, which is really, you bring those together, that's very similar idea to mindfulness-based emotional intelligence training, right? So fortunately, at least some children are being introduced to that very early on, because what could be more important human skills to learn than how to regulate this incredibly complex system called the human mind and body, and then how to communicate with others and how to manage our emotions. I mean, what could be more important in our life, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And like I have found it very um cathartic maybe to teach my clients that emotions by design have a purpose. So when
Absolutely.
we are off balance, when we're not connected to both our logic brain and our emotional brain. And we wonder why there's this rub, right? Well, because I'm trying so hard to get away from one or the other. And so I'm off kilter and I'm off balance. But the reality is emotions were just designed to give us information. So if we're not paying attention,
Exactly.
which we have to be mindfully present before we even know that we're feeling something. So yeah, I really liked that. And what you said, Fleet, in your last training about we really aren't victims to our circumstance all the time. I can't remember exactly, that we invite circumstances or we promote our circumstances. That really got me thinking, we have so much more power over us than we ever are taught. And that kind of goes along with that grit concept, right? Like if maybe it's an empowering sort of thing versus enabling, or I don't know. I'm done talking.
Yeah. And I want to be clear, people are victimized in terrible ways, and we're seeing
Right. No, and I know that.
we're seeing in Ukraine right now is terrible. But are we training people to have greater capacity for self-healing and to be able to not be completely debilitated by the trauma they experience? Or are we training people to get so identified with their traumas that it becomes the narrative of their life, right? And is that really helpful? Thank you very much, Rachel.